Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. ربنا لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك ولعظيم سلطانك سبحانك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I would like to welcome you, all of those who are here and those who might come subsequently to this lecture as part of Zaytuna College's Black History Lecture Series. We have a wonderful, wonderful program in store for you tonight. Our very own Dr. Abdullah Ali, will be talking about themes related to his dissertation. He will be introduced by the person I will introduce, so I will refrain from any further comments or accolades in that regard. So we'd like to bring before you, first of all, we'd be remiss if we didn't open the program by a few verses from the Book of Allah, the Quran, recited by Zaytuna College's very own Yusuf Sayyal. Yusuf is a senior here at the college, moving rapidly towards graduation, completion of his tenure here from my home state, the wonderful, beautiful state of Connecticut, hailing from Bridgeport, Connecticut, a place that used to scare a lot of people. But Yusuf went there and he calmed things down with his calm, pleasant demeanor. So without further ado, I would like to bring before Yusuf Sayyal. He will recite a few verses from the Quran and then translate them into English, and then we will proceed with our program. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you very much. Yusuf, تفضل مشكورا غير مأمور.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا ولما يدخل الإيمان في قلوبكم وإن تطيعوا الله ورسوله لا يلتكم من أعمالكم شيئا إن الله غفور رحيم. إنما المؤمنون الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله ثم لم يرتابوا وجاهدوا بأموالهم وأنفسهم في سبيل الله أولئك هم الصادقون. So in the name of God, the loving, the compassionate, O mankind, we have created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes, so that you may know one another. Verily, the most honorable of you with God is that who has God consciousness. Verily, God is all-knowing, well acquainted. The Bedouins say, we believe. Say, you believe not, but you only say, we have surrendered, for faith has not yet entered into your hearts. But if you obey God and his messenger, he will not decrease anything in reward for your deeds. Verily, God is oft forgiving, most merciful. Only those are the believers who have believed in God and his messenger, and afterward doubt not, but strive with their wealth and their lives for the cause of God. Those, they are the truthful. Sadaqallahu al-Azim.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we thank Yusuf for that beautiful recitation. This time we'd like to bring before you Kristin George. Kristen is a doctoral candidate in the sociology department at the University of California, Berkeley. She's also, and her work is very relevant to our topic in a certain sense. So she's doing work on the abolition of slavery here in the United States, the Protestant church during the 19th century, and race and gender in Islam. She will be discussant with Dr. Abdullah after his presentation, and she will introduce him. So at this time, ladies and gentlemen, all concerned, without further ado, we bring before you Kristin George. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Imam Zaid, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming this evening. I am now going to introduce our speaker this evening. Abdullah bin Hamid Ali is a faculty member here at Zaytuna College, whom I'm sure most of you are acquainted with. He teaches courses in Islamic law and the prophetic tradition. He also coordinates Zaytuna's Islamic law program and serves as an integral part of its Living Links honors program. He is a lifelong student of the Islamic tradition. He was born to Muslim parents and began a serious study of Islam in his early teens. He attended Temple University for 2 years prior to pursuing studies that culminated in a 4-year collegiate license from the prestigious Al-Qarawiyyin University in Fez, Morocco. He holds a BA from Al-Qarawiyyin and in Islamic law, and an MA in ethics and social theory, and a PhD in cultural and historical studies and religion from the Graduate Theological Union here in Berkeley, California. He teaches courses in the prophetic tradition, in commercial law, family law, inheritance law, and jurisprudential principles. So without further ado, Sheikh Abdullah, please come in.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam. Ala ashraf al-anbiya, wa sayyid al-mursalin, nabiyina Muhammad, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Peace be unto everybody, and welcome tonight. I really appreciate all of you coming out and also tuning in for those who are watching online. And today I've been given this particular task, a somewhat enormous task, to speak about an issue which is a little bit sensitive, but it pertains to my doctoral dissertation, which is entitled The Negro and Afro-Arabian Muslim Consciousness. And so earlier today, what I've been doing in my office was sort of trying to pick out from my dissertation some selected excerpts from it and try to summarize the most salient aspects of the research to give everyone an overview of what the actual writing is about before we actually move on to a conversation. So originally I also wanted to just do an extemporaneous talk, but then I said, well, probably would be better if I just simply read at least this summary of this particular topic. So I begin. Beyond the phenotypic differences and similarities between various peoples, race exists not as a term of essential biological distinction, but one used to express a sociological phenomenon. The particular phenomenon under question is that of group identity and how it is formed vis-a-vis the other. Pre-modern societies were very insular and were largely defined by their shared languages, customs, and beliefs. Xenophobia was common and directed towards all outsiders unless by a certain shared principle the outsider was capable of achieving incorporation into the group. For Arabs, for instance, being born to an Arab father or acquiring fluency in the Arabic language and Arab custom made the Arabization process easy for non-Arabians. In other words, it was not color or shared phenotypic characteristics which determined authentic Arabness as perceived by many modern people. In later times, however, with the onset of the European Enlightenment and modernity, group identity started to be determined primarily by phenotypic differences like color, hair texture, and the shape of the nose and lips. This is not to suggest that pre-modern peoples did not have some minimalistic conception of race types, for they surely were familiar with the Noachian doctrine, which alleged that all the earth's living inhabitants were the offspring of one of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. No one can be certain, but perhaps a recollection of the doctrine of humanity's shared Adamic roots helped obviate the development of any significant early color-based prejudice. If we can view race as this process of group identity formation, it would mean that it is far more an experience rather than an expression of genetic uniformity. This is precisely the way that many anthropologists and contemporary scientists view race, as a largely sociological phenomenon rather than a biological fact. The pre-modern experience of race allowed for a greater inclusion of people of diverse phenotypes than the modern experience, which restricts alikeness to skin color. This would make blackness and whiteness, according to the definition of race, as a group identity formed in the crucible of the collective or shared experiences of a people vis-a-vis another's, nothing more than illusory and mere convenient classifications. Even the Arab perception of ethnic purity, as they delighted in the knowledge of their paternal roots and ancestral achievements, was derided by Ibn Khaldun, who said, lineage is an illusory matter which has no reality. النسب أمر وهمي لا حقيقة له. The boundaries of both blackness and whiteness have shifted from time and place in the past, and today not very much has changed in that regard. What has remained consistent for millennia, however, is the disdain for dark skin. According to certain linguists, in practically every language, there exist metaphors of black negative and white positive. The etiology of the linguistic phenomenon is difficult to determine, but there appears to be a perennial disdain for blackness in particular and darker skin more generally. Is this problem particular to a certain ethnic demographic, or is it a more general human challenge? I believe the problem is a ubiquitous one. I have chosen, however, to focus on one manifestation of this in the Muslim tradition, that is the Maliki school and the larger Islamic tradition. This dissertation offers an explanation of why indigenous black Africans were not alienated from Islam despite the existence of alleged prophetic traditions and legal teachings in the Maliki school of law which disparage and discriminate against black Africans. It asserts that while color-based prejudice is fairly recent in human history, black antipathy, on the other hand, is a perennial phenomenon. The equatorial and sub-Saharan Bantu-speaking cannibalistic black has been caricatured by a number of ancient writers as the prototypical savage. This dissertation asserts that it is from this caricature that the concept of the Negro was formulated. The fact that pre-modern cultures largely identified as cultural rather than biological races, unlike what is often the case today, made it easier for most Africans to dispense with black disapprobation, which sometimes manifested itself in Muslim society and Islamic literature. The title of my doctoral dissertation is The Negro in Afro-Arabian Muslim Consciousness. The assertion is that the Negro and the African are not completely conterminous from the standpoint of anthropological classification. Certainly, the term Negro has been utilized in America to refer to any person discovered as possessing any degree of sub-Saharan black African heritage. We know, however, that the Sahara is merely a part of the African continent, and its surrounding inhabitants represent only a portion of its people. In addition, for the early Arabs and other Muslims, both the idea of a continent and one bordering Arabia called Africa would have been unfamiliar territory. The only Africa that any of them would have been familiar with would have been Ifriqiya, that is the northwestern sector comprised of Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia, a name popularized during the Roman Empire's rule of that region. The term Negro is believed to have come into English during the transatlantic slave trade as a convenient way to describe, quote unquote, uncivilized sub-Saharan blacks, especially those who were enslaved. The Arabic English lexicographers Hans Wehr and J.G. Hava both translate the Arabic word zanj as Negro. The word zanj was used by medieval Arabs as a general reference to East Africans near the Horn of Africa, and more specifically for Bantu-speaking cannibals, originally from the region of Zanzibar. This is despite the fact that the term's history extends well beyond the creation of the English word Negro. So to consider them to be perfect synonyms appears to be inappropriately retroactive and anachronistic. There is, however, good reason to consider this translation to be fitting. From Arabic lexicographers, we learn that the zanj, the word for Negro, live near or below the equator. Secondly, we know that they have black skin. Then a third note about the zanj is that they are not the, but a group of blacks, which underscores the fact that pre-modern anthropologists did not view all blacks in homogeneous terms. This is important for our discussion, since as already suggested, the zanj may have been black, but not all blacks were affiliated with the zanj. On the other hand, the Oxford English Dictionary defines the Negro as a member of a dark-skinned group of peoples originally native to sub-Saharan Africa. This primary definition of the Negro corresponds with the Arabic zanj in that the Negro is, 1, a person with black skin, and 2, a person who originates from sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps one subtle distinction which can be made is that in terms of latitude, the zanj is a sub-equatorial person, while the Negro is characterized merely as sub-Saharan. Despite this subtlety, both the sub-Sahara and equatorial regions are known to be lands inhabited by blacks, which would strongly suggest translational equivalency between the two terms, zanj and Negro, especially since, as certain Arabic lexicographers highlight, that some hold that the zanj region extends from Ethiopia and parts of the Nile in the east to the Maghreb on the western coast. Another important point is that realities precede their designations. That the word Negro was adopted during the transatlantic slave trade does not necessitate that the concept of the uncivilized black did not exist in other cultures prior to that period. This is no more the case than the tenuous notion that just because ancient people did not have a concept of continent, that the landmass we describe today as Africa did not exist. For there are countless words in various languages invented to describe a variety of objects, inventions, discoveries, concepts, and phenomena which already existed in the lives and minds of people. So to argue that words like city, stone, wheat, horse, or wisdom are English words whose pronunciation differs greatly from their synonyms in other languages, or that they were simply borrowed from them in a certain century, would be to suggest that the history of a concept or phenomenon begins with the invention of its popular designation. Even the racialized terms white, black, and Arab are utilized throughout this dissertation have been in constant flux over the centuries. In addition, the fact that Negro lost many of its more negative connotations during 20th century America does not prove that it was not originally utilized to describe a stark-naked, cannibalistic human being from East Africa. According to historian John G. Jackson, in the literature on Africa, Africans are commonly identified in two groups, one progressive, the other backward. The progressive peoples are called Hamites, Cushites, Moors, etc., whereas the backward ones are called Negroes. Black has not always been beautiful in African American circles, but even before the term African American became the most common designation for formerly enslaved peoples of African descent, they, that is we, were commonly referred to and self-referentially as Negroes. The 20th century African American activist Richard B. Moore, in his The Name Negro, Its Origin and Its Evil Use, fiercely advocated for relinquishing the use of the term Negro and adopting the designation Afro or African American. Moore did not appreciate the fact that the term connoted unequal civil status, being that the only difference between a nigger and a Negro was that one was a slave and the other was supposedly free. Both, unfortunately, still suffered the stigma of subhuman status and or second, third, or even fourth class citizenship. In addition, Moore felt that by prefixing American with Afro or African would serve as a type of psychocultural equalizer, in as much that others who immigrated to America also sported a hyphenated identity based upon land, culture, and history. On the other hand, the African-American historian Carter G. Woodson, who actually is, in many ways, the founder of Black History Month, he was the one who actually had the first. He's having the Negro History Week, which should be celebrated during the second week of February because of Lincoln's birthday and also Frederick Douglass's birthday. But according to Carter G. Woodson, who wrote in his The Miseducation of the Negro, he says, "It does not matter so much what the thing is called as what the thing is." So he's objecting to Richard B. Moore's insistence on changing Negro to something different. So he continues, he says, "The Negro would not cease to be what he is by calling him something else. But if he will struggle and make something of himself and contribute to modern culture, the world will learn to look upon him as an American rather than as one of an undeveloped element of the population." He further says, "There is nothing to be gained by running away from the name. The names of practically all races and nations at times have connoted insignificance and low social status. Angles and Saxons, once the slaves of Romans, experienced this. And even the name of the Greek for a while meant no more than this to these conquerors of the world. The people who bore these names, however, have made them grand and illustrious. The Negro must learn to do the same." Islam's expansion into Africa beginning during the 7th century brought with it the cultural influence of Arabia upon the lives of the indigenous populations. Arabs did not only conquer and migrate with their families, they intermarried with the local tribespeople, as was already normative prior to Islam, and naturally produced offspring. It is to these I refer as Afro-Arabians. For the purpose of this dissertation, the designation Afro-Arabian applies to any person of Arab heritage born and raised in Africa, even with only a tenuous connection to Arabia, those of mixed heritage, or any indigenous person who appropriated Arab culture. I include them all under the designation Afro-Arabian or Afro-Arabian Muslim. It is typically from the works of such scholars whose comments about blackness that I examine. Sharia is fundamentally the moral code introduced by the Prophet Muhammad of Arabia over 1,400 years ago. It is the law as revealed to him by Allah, God. Since not every law is clear, scholarly interpretation has augmented and expanded the meaning of Sharia to include the jurisprudence codified and preserved in various legal schools. In the Sunni tradition, there are 4 leading legal schools or schools of thought: the Hanafi school, the Maliki school, the Shafi'i school, and the Hanbali school. With the patronage of dynastic rule over the centuries, these schools crystallized and became preeminent, especially once appropriated by the local rulers. Consequently, cultures formed surrounding the teachings of each school in the various regions of Muslim social interaction. And since pre-modern modes of transportation limited the possibilities for regular intercultural exchange between peoples, they were left to imagine themselves as occupying worlds, though ideologically distinct, that accurately reconstituted the reality of socio-religious existence during the prophetic era. In other words, if a region was governed by the Hanafi or Maliki schools, for instance, in the minds of the masses, they were not merely following a school of thought. They were, in fact, following the Sharia. Having studied in North Africa myself in the country of Morocco, I have received considerable grounding in the Maliki school of law, since it is the official school of the kingdom and most Muslim countries in North and West Africa. I am also reasonably versed in the laws of the other 3 surviving Sunni schools. Interestingly, while perusing the major law works of the other schools, I have not as easily been able to locate the sort of disparaging comments found about blacks that I found amongst particular scholars of the Maliki school. Maybe the reason was that the other schools were encountering largely non-black cultures, while the Maliki school flourished in areas predominated by blacks. Or maybe the silence about the derogatoriness of blackness was negligible, since those cultures operated on the presumption of that notion. Whatever the case, we find that most indigenous Africans follow the Maliki school, and one might reasonably assume that Africans, or any people for that matter, would steer clear of a school whose doctrines explicitly endorse an inferior role and consideration for the black African. I do not think I need to speak more of the paradox of this situation. Notwithstanding the difficulty in identifying similar patterns in other schools, in the prophetic tradition, there exists a sufficient number of anti-black hadiths, though largely deemed apocryphal. During the prophetic era, the universality of Islam was underscored through the inclusion of 4 personalities in the inner circle of the Prophet Muhammad: Bilal the Ethiopian, Salman the Persian, Abdullah the Jew, and Suhaib the Greek. Today, many have begun to challenge Muslim claims of Islam's racial egalitarianism in light of more and more scholars unearthing a culture of bigotry among some of Islam's noted theologians and jurists, along with proof of mistreatment and prejudicial dealings toward indigenous Muslim Africans during the prophetic era and after the Arab incursion into the African continent. Malcolm X's experiences have been useful for the image of Arabs particularly, especially in light of constant Pan-Africanist assertions that Arabs played a pivotal role in the transatlantic slave trade. As my research reveals, it was to the black-skinned, Bantu-speaking, bare-skinned, cannibalistic East African of the Sub-Sahara that most medieval writers referred when remarking disparagingly about blacks. It is they who represent the prototypical, stereotypical Negro. A major goal of this dissertation was to present the argument, particularly to uncritical Muslim readers and teachers of the Islamic tradition, that cultural bias at times has influenced saintly personalities' interpretation of the revealed law. This was the case with major authorities in the Maliki legal school, which was adopted in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Andalus. Therefore, it is important to understand the perils of encouraging blind, uncritical acceptance of scholarly spiritual authority. The dissertation focuses on the sources that reinforce black antipathy in the general Islamic tradition, things such as marital undesirability, presumed dysmorphia, and animalistic impulse, and in the Maliki school, more specifically, things such as unequal social protections for black, quote-unquote, black women seeking marriage, along with reactions from black African scholars living during and after the European Age of Enlightenment. Through a text-based study of indigenous African reactions to the trend of anti-black Malikism and other aspects of the Muslim legacy which devalue black existence, I will complicate a popular assumption that the Maliki school, which has attracted indigenous blacks, is free of teachings which devalue human beings on the basis of color. I will contend that African Muslims did not view themselves as a racially homogeneous collective, the very thing which made it possible for so many of them to embrace Malikism and dispense with black disapprobation. The Maliki school is one of 4 surviving Sunni legal schools, which originally split into 4 sectors: Medina, Egypt, Iraq, and the Maghreb, including Andalus. And they split into those sectors after the death of its 8th century eponym, Imam Malik ibn Anas. Malik was known as the scholar of Medina, to whom students and scholars from the surrounding metropolises and towns would travel to earn the privilege of his tutelage. In light of a very long career in teaching, a number of his foreign students, upon returning to their homelands, would possess conflicting reports concerning his views on a number of issues. Consequently, representation of his actual views would at times be difficult to ascertain. For most Maliki scholars, however, wherever discrepancies persisted, the most authoritative views would be those of Egypt, and most importantly, what was transmitted by his senior student, Abdurrahman ibn Qasim. Certain Egyptian Sufi scholars of Azhar University during the centuries of the European Enlightenment are extremely important for the current discussion. That they lived during this period is not meant to imply that this was a very time in Muslim history wherein negativity about black skin color or nature was ever heard. For we will see that black antipathy found its way into the general Muslim tradition as well as others. Rather, the point is that from among the many Maliki jurists and theologians, it appears that from these issue some of the most explicit devaluations of blacks or the Negro. Sheikh Ahmed ibn Muhammad as-Sawi suggests a transhistorical presumption of black or brown being the color of slaves. The Maliki Sufi scholar Ibrahim ibn Mar'i al-Shubrakhiti reduces beauty and ugliness of people to the single factors of either whiteness or blackness of skin tone. And regarding the rights of marriage guardians for women, the major jurists of the Maliki school legitimize a double standard for the ignoble or black woman, thereby denying the said woman the protections given to a woman of noble status, a situation which results in hindering her clansmen from being able to safeguard her from the potential harms of suitors of whom they disapprove. The justificatory logic of the said jurist is that the black and or ignoble woman is undesirable. She is therefore without value and compatible with any male suitor. It must be understood, though, that the black woman is only one from a general class of women deemed to be undesirable in marriage. Undesirability results from lacking beauty, wealth, lineage, or celebrated roots, as when one's father was known for piety and magnanimity. Maliki scholars include in this category the manumit and the unappealing non-Arab convert. The point of singling out the black woman in this discussion is merely to highlight how her undesirability in the school is determined according to the leading authorities by the single factor of color as opposed to the other woman? Why not underscore the presumed whiteness of the Musalmaniya, or the non-Arab convert, and make that a sufficient basis for undesirability or ugliness, as was the case with the black woman? Due to the aforesaid bases of undesirability, the normal order of priority given to marriage guardians may be bypassed, and even a non-relative guardian may perform her marriage in the presence of a blood relative. On the other hand, a number of Malikis challenged this rule, insisting that no distinction should be made between a noble and ignoble, or sharifa and daniya, regarding the matter of guardianship. So one should be careful not to assume that all Malikis endorse this bias. In light of this amazing phenomenon, I was led to pose the following questions. How have black Africans been able to keep faith in a moral code they believe to be inspired by God, which degrades and maligns them simply due to complexion? Did they simply ignore the disparaging claims against them as nothing more than the personal bias of bigoted jurists? Or did they define their collective identities in such a way that allowed them to exclude themselves from black membership? Or maybe in matters of law, they relied more upon the writings of local indigenous African scholars who excised those offensive teachings from their specific legal texts. In my research, I have found some evidence of African resistance to the offensive suggestions about them, but also of attempts by some to disassociate themselves from any African or black origins. There also exist non-canonical traditions in the Islamic archives that portray Africans as accepting and reinforcing their inferior status and beauty when compared with whites or those of lighter complexion. So I guess what I end with is just to highlight the point that while many of these things sound, I guess just like controversial, and they are controversial and perhaps can make many of us feel uneasy, that we can't lose sight of the fact that ideas about race have been in flux for a very long time. And most of our ideas about race are largely socially constructed. Black doesn't mean the same thing today in America as it means in Brazil, or as it means even in Haiti. I can go to Haiti and I'm not black anymore, or Brazil, I'm not black anymore. Imam Zaid's not black in Brazil, right? Or if you go to the Muslim world, the same thing. Even today, sometimes African Americans, they find themselves in conversations with some who are from the Caribbean or perhaps even from the African continent, and are really sometimes taken aback, I guess you would say, when they discover that they don't have the same fire for the cause as African Americans would want them to have. And I say that largely because they had a different experience. Their experience is different. Their race is an expression largely about an experience, a sort of a collective sense of identity that results from an experience that all of us have had vis-a-vis another group of people. So I think that's probably a good place to sort of pause and then move on to our conversation. So hopefully a bit of clarity, a bit more clarity can be given to what we've already heard, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thought you were done with me. Allah loves the odd. I came up twice, so I had to come up a third time to get a little bit of love from our Lord, who loves the odd. Actually, I came up here to remind you of our sponsors, the Graduate Theological Union, Center for Islamic Studies, and the head of that particular operation, Dr. Munir Jiwa, is here. Dr. Munir, can you stand up so that folks can, he was here. There he is, back there. The Center for Race and Gender Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. Is anyone from that center here? You can stand up and represent. If not, they're co-sponsoring the program, and of course, your very own Zaytuna College. So hold on to your seats. I'm sure after that stimulating presentation by Dr. Ali that you're looking forward to an even more stimulating conversation, discussion, articulation of some of those myriad deep and interesting ideas. So I invite Kristen to take her seat here, and let's get to it. Assalamu alaikum.
By the way, just if anybody's mad at me about something I said, you got to be mad at Dr. Munir as well. He was my advisor, so.
So he let you get away with all that?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very
Spread
much.
it around.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Your work is fascinating and yes, definitely controversial. So I want to start by posing some questions of my own, and then as people get warmed up, they can come and you can stick yourself somewhere in that front row so I can know that you have a question, or you can just line up if it seems like a good opportunity. I'll also stop here and there to check in with our online audience and see if there are questions there. So I guess first I want to start with a pretty big question, and that is that you approach the scholarly tradition simultaneously with reverence and a deep desire to see the traditional scholarship continue into the contemporary period, but also with a willingness to critique it and to look at the scholars as humans in their own historical moments. So I guess I want to hear you speak a little bit about that challenge, the challenge of both deference to the scholars and also sort of responsible criticism. Are there limits to how much we can critique, and then how do you do that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's not easy to, because on one level it is easy to critique anybody. Anybody can critique someone, but to critique with love, and maintain respect, and continue to see the humanity and those who you actually are critiquing, as opposed to simply trying to tear them down, trying to put them in context, in historical context, in their own sort of socio-cultural context, and judge them on the standards, first and foremost, that they lived under. There's a tendency today, I think, among people to just assume that we got it all right now, and our own moral sensibilities today can just simply be projected on the past, and we can say, we're going to utilize current modern standards, and we're going to critique and attack those backwards people, those people from the old days who just didn't know what the heck they were doing. They weren't evolved enough, right? That's why they had these views. And I think in particular with regard to Muslim scholars, there's a tendency to think, especially when you come across, let's say, Muslim scholars, like other religious scholars historically, who have made offensive statements about women or about different racial groups, that we assume that their opinions are just simply informed by, patriarchal sort of presumptions, and so it's some of that in there. Yes, we do have to acknowledge that, but it's not always that. Sometimes scholars they adopt views of other people based upon a commitment to faith. And meaning that they may come across something that they believe to be actually revealed by God, that actually may be from the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. And they want to maintain a commitment to their faith. So if they say, well, the Prophet said it, then it must be true, right? So I know this may be offensive to all those people, but if the Prophet said it, you understand, but not knowing, and most of the time those type of hadiths, of course, they are probably all those hadiths that are that offensive about any particular group usually turn out to be apocryphal. It'd be fabricated, spurious types of hadith. As a matter of fact, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, a famous scholar, student of Ibn Taymiyyah, he said all the hadiths about blacks are just fabricated. He said any hadith you find that is disparaging of black people, they're just all fabricated. But again, you'll find scholars who might say, it's good enough. Right, they feel like, they're using their methods to authenticate a particular report, and they say, okay, well, I'm going to adopt this and spread it around. So I think that that's an important part of it too, is that just to understand where people, what's motivating people. It's not just simply this idea that we want to lord over people necessarily. It's not always the case, but I do think that that's an assumption that a lot of people will make, typically make in the times we live in. And so when I approach things, I feel like I'm doing an internal critique. I'm not like an outsider's critique where I'm utilizing someone else's standards. I'm using Islamic standards to critique people within our tradition. And most importantly now, and this is that, as I mentioned, that one of the things I wanted to do, I want to humanize scholars. I want people to realize that, well, okay, they're not prophets. That the scholars, they are the heirs of the prophets. But there's a difference between being an heir of the prophets and being the prophet. They're still not prophets at the end of the day, you understand? And being they're the heirs, they inherit a type of knowledge. Naturally, they inherit sometimes even a type of spirituality, according to certain types of beliefs, not necessarily that I kind of, sort of adopt that. But it's something that they inherit a particular, a legacy that they get from those who come before them. And so I think that when we emphasize that and realize that scholars at times just have opinions, you understand? They have opinions, and I may agree with most of their opinions, but sometimes they have opinions that are just informed by their own socio-cultural context that leads them to, you understand, to kind of be a little bit off there. And so, we can say, well, I don't really agree with them there on that particular point, and I can continue to appreciate them in other parts. I say, well, we won't, he's not an authority here, but, he said some good stuff over there. It's in the same way, in the Enlightenment thinkers, most Enlightenment thinkers were racist in their thinking. But would I just dump everybody just because they had racial, that they looked down upon certain groups of people and had certain, sort of blinkered sort of ideas about people, or Abraham Lincoln, he still believed that that African Americans are inferior to white people. But should I knock him because, yeah, I like him because of that, but it's like, yeah, but was it bad that he freed the slaves? I can talk about like why he might have done it. Did he do it because he really wanted slavery to be in, or he did it because of political expediency? At the end of the day, that really doesn't matter on one level. He gave his life for a decision, a belief that he had, but he still had ideas about black people that I don't agree with, So I can appreciate one thing about them, or most things about them, and still see the humanity in people.
So for most Muslims, obviously the people in this room are more educated than the average Muslim, but even in this room, there might be times when we encounter issues like this in the scholarship where we're troubled by something we read. Right. How does a person without your extensive training deal with those subjects? How do you ascertain whether this is just a scholar's problem or whether this is maybe something that you need to rethink your own? Yeah.
Well, I usually advise people the first thing is that as a person of faith, that if you're dealing with something that you come across in the Quran or something you come across in the authenticated Sunnah of the Prophet, that if you are troubled by it, then that is, first and foremost, that's not a problem. That you be troubled by something. There are many things that you can be troubled by. There are things in the Quran calls us to do certain things or allow certain things that, a lot of people say, well, I wouldn't do that. For instance, you can marry your cousin. I wouldn't marry my cousin. I'm like, I wouldn't, I couldn't do it. But it's okay to marry your cousin. So sometimes you'll be troubled by things. So that in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think it's important for Muslims, especially, that when we approach the Quran, that we have to surrender to the fact or the belief that we're supposed to have that God is all wise, that God, He knows best. And I may not have the right interpretation right now, right? Or the interpretations I hear may not really fit my fancy, or I guess you say they don't really seem to add up, right? let's leave fit the fancy out, because, if you're a person of faith, then fitting your fancy really is of no consequence. But it doesn't add up to me. It doesn't seem to really make sense to me, right? Then at least I don't doubt God's wisdom. I don't question God's wisdom. I say, it's okay. Guide me, help me here. Help me on this one, you see. And I think we begin as people of faith. And then we search and we read and whatever, so we'll come across foolish people who are Muslims, a lot of foolish Muslims out there who have very crazy ideas about things as well. But we just try our best not to feel that those people are speaking for God. Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you've talked about, in your dissertation and in your discussion, you mentioned the issues around different treatments of black women versus white women when it came to marriage, and other instances where there's like a clear black-white hierarchy in the minds of scholars. You've also been very clear that in general, the Quran doesn't necessarily promote like social egalitarianism, like you talk about slavery as a legal institution. How do we differentiate from what's the difference between the black-white sort of race hierarchies that some of the scholars seem to have, and then the actual sort of social institutions that may be legitimate in the Quran?
Yeah, there's a difference between social hierarchy and moral hierarchy, or spiritual hierarchy, I guess you would say. What are the three? Moral, spiritual. There are spiritual hierarchies as well, and the Quran confirms that, تِلْكَ الرُّسُلُ فَضَّلْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. They're messengers. Some messengers are better than messengers. I mean, some of the prophets are more superior than others, that the prophets are better than we are, that their faith is perfect compared, to anyone else's. It's like some of the theologians would say that don't say imani misla imani Jibril, that my faith is equal to the faith of Gabriel. You could say imani ka imani Jibril, rather my faith is like the faith of Jibril, that meaning that we believe in the same things. His faith is he's more certain, his faith. So there are spiritual hierarchies, but I'm focused on the two, social hierarchy and moral hierarchy. Like moral hierarchy, what I mean by that is this idea that Allah or God, He prefers certain people over others simply because of who they are or the way that they look, right? Because, so men are better than women because he's a man, right? Over, used to be here most of the time, you often say the opposite, but so that in itself is a problem, right? And this is completely unfounded in our tradition, this idea that a man is automatically better than a woman in the sight of God, right? In the sight of God, simply because he's a man, right? Even though there's some exegetes who have attempted to make those kind of arguments, and it's some things there in our tradition, unfortunately. But the Quran, in akramakum inda Allah atqakum, the actual verse, one of the verses that Yusuf had recited, the most honorable of you, the most noble of you in the sight of God are the ones with the most taqwa, most piety, and that could be a man or a woman. So moral hierarchies, no, there's no moral hierarchy between man and woman at all. Social hierarchy, Islam reinforces a certain degree of social hierarchy. And so I think, in a sense, in the family, the man has greater responsibility, or the man is the shepherd of the family, right? That this is among the prophetic teachings, the Quranic teaching, الرجال قوامون على النساء, that men are the caretakers of women. There is there is that in the Quran, is in the Sunnah, it does exist, that parents are over their children, right? It's not the opposite, children over their parents. No, there's some degree, the governors over the governed, right? So there is social hierarchy, but I think the problem, the challenge that we have today is with trying to differentiate or trying to avoid equating social hierarchy with moral hierarchy, right? You get me? You follow me? So I think that's the problem, that people think, okay, because I'm in charge, or I'm responsible. You should think about it like that. I'm responsible, meaning that you know, as opposed to I'm in charge. You know, you're responsible, right? Meaning that you're going to get yourself in trouble, right? If you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, right? That it means that God thinks I'm better, right? On a spiritual, moral level, right? That God values me more spiritually. So it means that when I go to heaven, I'm going to be there in the penthouse, and the woman's going to be on the first floor. No, so it's unfortunate that there is that idea that a lot of people have, and even Muslims. Some Muslims make this mistake to think that way. I remember growing up and being with some older brothers, and I remember brother, he said to me one time, he said, I don't believe a woman can ever be as good as a man or better than a man. You know, and his rationalization was, you know, because they don't pray half of the time, they don't fast half of the time, they can't pray as much as we can. Well, really they can, because my wife, she prays a whole lot more than I do. So fast a whole lot more than I do. So, but again, it's a problem in the minds of a lot of people, you know. So this confusion between moral and social hierarchy, yeah. So being in a position, yeah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He chooses you for a position because He gave you certain natural tools or natural advantages, I guess you would say, that makes you the most fit person to do that, right? Right, you know. So, and of course, especially in the old days, it's like, listen, you know, he's faster, men are faster, you know, they're stronger, more aerodynamic. Right? You know, so okay, you go, you hunt, you take care, you defend, right? So God gave you some tools, and you protect the woman, right? But that doesn't make her not loved by God, or you more loved by God. You see, you know, that you have responsibility, she has a responsibility too. If she fulfills the responsibility and you don't, she's better than you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's going to reward her and not reward you. You see, so that is, I think, at the root of a lot of our confusion in this time, is confusing those two things.
Okay, I guess our audience probably wants to ask some questions too, but I want to get one last in, and that is, you know, I want to, you're addressing these really sensitive issues about race that, you know, because, you know, so many people are, you know, continuing to experience everyday racism or are very emotional for people. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit spiritually to how one should deal with these like a painful issue like this, about hearing from, you know, scholars say such negative things about Black people or about Black skin, and also even more broadly, you talked about sort of the perennial problem of anti-Black sentiment.
Right.
How do believers deal with that reality?
Right. Well, the first thing, it goes back to what I mentioned before about remembering that the heirs are not the same as those who they are heirs to. And it's okay, in my opinion, to, I guess you say, lose faith in a scholar. You understand? It's okay. But if we lose faith in the messenger of God, and we lose faith in God, then I think that's a problem, right? And we have to remember that God only wants good for us, and God does not discriminate on the basis of such superficial characteristics, right? That God is looking, إِنَّمَا هِيَ أَعْمَالُكُمْ أَحْصِيهَا لَكُمْ, you know, as the Hadith Qudsi goes, it said, I'm only looking at your deeds. You know, I'm going to count your deeds. ثُمَّ أُوَفِيكُمْ إِيَّاهَا, you know, then I'm going to recompense you for them. That's what God is looking at. فَمَنْ وَجَدَ خَيْرًا فَيَحْمِدِ اللَّهِ. Whoever finds good, let him thank God. وَمَنْ وَجَدَ غَيْرَ ذَلِكَ فَلَا يُلُومَنَّ إِلَّا نَفْسَهُ. And whoever finds other than that, blame nobody but yourself, right? That is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, you know, He looks at that, you know. He doesn't look at your outward forms and things like that. We have to remind one another of those teachings, that these are prophetic teachings, these are divine teachings, you know. But when we find a learned person, you know, who has outdated or perhaps just flawed or problematic views of things, and especially of people, then we say, okay, no problem. He showed his humanity. He's revealed his humanity, and so we're expected to follow the best. الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَهُ. Those people who hear words and they follow the best of it. They follow the best part of it, you know. أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَاهُمُ اللَّهُ. The Quran said those are the ones God has guided. Guidance is given to those people, you know. So that's the advice that I would give to people, just to turn to God, turn to the words of God, turn to the words of His Messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam, and judge everything by that. So, but to lose faith in the scholar, it's unfortunate. We don't want people to do that. But if it happens, then it should not be something that shakes our faith. You know, and I think this is also another problem that we have in this age, is because there is, on one level, somewhat of a, I don't want to use too harsh of a term, but the thing that came to mind was like, you know, sort of like scholar worship. You know, it's like sheikh worship, you know, where we're kind of expecting all of our answers from scholars, you know, like, you know, about every single issue, you know, that we expect them to be everything for us, to be being our father, to be our, you know, everything, you know, and we expect them to be perfect too. But then the moment we realize, oh my God, he uses the bathroom. Oh my God, he's not perfect, right? Then people get chased away from religion. And I say the problem is not the sheikh. The problem is you. That your faith was connected to the wrong thing. See, and it reminds me of when I used to work as a chaplain in the prison. There was an individual who had sent me a letter one time. He was a lifer, and he sent me a letter to my office and was like, you know, take me off of all of the Islamic activities. You know, I don't want my name on in there, because he just got tired of a lot of controversy that was going on in the blocks, and guys were talking about me. They didn't like me too much, you know. So it really gave him a headache. And when I called him down to talk to me, it became clear that his faith was attached to the community. That, like, as long as he saw the community united, he was a good Muslim, right? But once he saw the unity gone, then his faith was gone, right? And I'm not saying that shouldn't. I mean, you know, people develop. You know, the levels that people go through. But people to understand that the highest level is for us to be attached to God and attached to His Messenger. Right, so instead of blaming the sheikh, blame ourselves, you know, and then in that way you can come back and say, you know what, I can appreciate you now, because I can see your humanity, and I can say, listen, okay, well, listen, I'm not trying to hear that, you know what, you know, but over here when you say that, you follow me? So that, I think that's the attitude we have to have.
Thank you very much. Now I guess. Members of the audience, if you want to go ahead and come up to the microphone here, you can form a little line if there's more than one of you. Go for it.
Can we take a question from online while they assemble?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Jamal asks, Dr. Ali, in regards to the Maliki madhab, is it pervasive for African Americans to study that madhab or school, in that many of their ancestors were under the jurisdiction of that madhab? What are your personal thoughts on that? Did you personally consciously choose to study that madhab, or do you consider it simply a grace from God?
I mean, my decision to follow the madhab really kind of resulted from a conversation that this was back before I went to Morocco. I think it was with myself, Dr. Jackson, and a few other people in Philadelphia at the time, and we were talking about, you know, adopting a school. And for some reason, the Maliki school sort of came up, and then going to Morocco afterwards sort of reinforced it. It's like, I already adopted the Maliki school, then I went to Morocco, and, you know, then it's like, well, I'm just kind of locked in. So it wasn't, you know, now, of course, historically, we know that many of our West African ancestors were people who followed the Maliki school, and you know, but for me, I guess I feel less committed to the school because of nostalgia, or this attempt to sort of romanticize the past, attempt to sort of recreate, a legacy or follow a legacy. But I like the Maliki school. I think it's just more the principles of the school that Malikis accept all the usul and the other schools don't. And I just kind of think that it makes it a bit more dynamic, in a lot of different ways. It hasn't always been that way, but that's the Maliki school today. Just like all of the different sources of Islamic law, the Malikis accept them, and the other schools they don't accept many of the sources that the Malikis accept. So, yes.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Could you perhaps speak on some of the solutions that Islam provides in regards to race, and the tensions caused by race, and also in regards to black people in America dealing with their incidental struggle racially and socioeconomically? What solutions does Islam principally provide?
Yeah, the solutions Islam principally provide for issues of race it begins with, as the Prophet said, birru husnul khuluq, that righteousness is good conduct, and also he mentioned that وَخَالِقِ النَّاسِ بِخُلْقٍ حَسَنٍ, that we treat people well. I mean, it's more largely about treatment, realistically. You want to ask something? It looks like.
No.
Oh, it's all about treatment, realistically. I mean, I personally don't believe that we can ever stop being prejudiced. I think you can only manage it better, your prejudice. Everybody's prejudiced. I mean, people prejudice. I mean, when you want to get married, right? You look for a certain type of woman, right? You say, well, I like this kind, I like that kind, right? I mean, certain types of food, you like. Some people like biryani, some people like hamburgers. You understand? It's part of our nature. Allah, He made us that we prefer certain things, but we can manage things better when it comes to mistreatment and locking people out of privilege, right, and giving it to others simply because of the way they look or whatever, where they come from. So Islam gives us that, and that's what we see an example of the Prophet ﷺ, that anytime he saw even the Africans in his midst who were being mistreated, or being derided, that he had something to say about it, that he, there's so many different stories I can tell you, but that's really at the essence of it, is treating people the right way. And you want to ask something?
Well, just to make it more specific to the black context.
Right.
More specifically, what I'm trying to ask is, how can Islam empower black people, specifically black Muslims, but as well as offering Islam as a way of life to black people? How can it be empower them against the debilitating effects of racism systematically in this country?
Right. Oh, it can do quite a bit. I mean, Islam is not a selfish religion to begin with. It's not only like just ritual. This is private. Private practice. It's also public practice. It's ibadah and khidmah. It's worship and it's service to humanity. And so we have an obligation to enjoy good, forbid evil. But so there are external things, of course, that affect the state of the African American community, or just blacks in general, but also internal things as well that people have to consider. So externally, we know there are a lot of people involved with sort of litigation. They're trying to change laws, but in addition to that, there should be things happening in our community, like trying to reform or subhanAllah, the word is not there. Our family, reconstitute families. We need to things like that. So there are things we need to do internally as well. Islam, focuses on reconstitution of the family. It focuses on overcoming addiction, overcoming, irresponsibility, things like that. There are a lot of things, just like it did to Muslims and African Americans in the 50s and the 60s and beyond. Or even Imam Zaid, people his age, and he can tell you more about that. But there's a whole lot that Islam can do for us. But I think that if we're constantly looking for, again, a Messiah to come, or somebody come in and hey, he's going to solve it all for us, no, we have to realize that it's a group effort. Educating ourselves. More people need to go to school. and not only pursuing like white collar jobs, they pursue blue collar jobs. People should go into business. There are a lot of different things. Economics is an extremely important part of all of this issue. And one last thing I'll say is that there's been a lot of talk about like whether or not we live in a post-racial age. And of course, yeah, that's already, that question's been answered, right? You know, we were talking that a little while ago. But there's some people who, many of us, we really want to live in a post-racial world, right? And I think that that can only mean, it means one of two things. One way you live in a post-racial age is you just simply get rid of all designations, right? Racial designations, right? You get rid of census and things like that. But the problem with that is that you ignore people's experiences, you know, you make it seem like, you know, okay, well, nothing ever happened to anybody, you know, so it's like, so that's not going to work. But the other way is to allow everyone to celebrate who they are. And in allowing everybody to celebrate who they are, they actually has to include white people. You understand that white people have to also be able to celebrate who they are, or we're never going to be in a post-racial age, you see. Where things are right now is that everybody else can celebrate who they are, but white people can't celebrate who they are. So as long as they're constantly reminded that, you know, you're not one of us, you understand? So it's, you know, so there's some things that can be done to help our community. They're both external and they're internal. But on the larger level, and of course Imam Zaid can add a lot more to this, but that's about all I have to say at the moment. Inshallah, we can talk more later if you feel like I can talk like it.
Sheikh, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Early in your paper, you talked about how African American. You talked about how
he shares your pain.
Yeah. It is painful. How early African American intellectuals wanted to build up the identity of the African American, and they saw how like you don't have to run away from it, you could turn it into something really big because this is who you are, this is how the world sees you. And I think for the past 100-something years, we've seen some really great institutions, some great work come out of the culture. But we're also seeing it like in decline now, like with black colleges, with just black work in general. And it's being favored, and integration, I guess, is being favored over just having black culture in general. So I guess my question is like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, what does that future look like? Because even though like the rhetoric might be, hey, we need to integrate, do this, do that, I think there's always some type of protectionism from all sides at the end of the day. So if you could just shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, in the African American community, we've always had this, from the very beginning at post-emancipation, we've had this sort of two paradigms, the integrationist and the separatist paradigm, you know, actually starting with perhaps Frederick Douglass and Delaney, his colleague, you know, so Frederick Douglass, integrationist, Delaney is a separatist. And so we've had that with it for a very long time, and most African Americans have tended to move in the direction of integration, and on some levels, integration has been disastrous for many, as we know. You know, but for those groups were a little bit more separatist, you know, we call them nationalists today, perhaps, I guess you would say, that we have evidence of the nationalist approach being successful in certain ways, especially when we take into consideration that really everybody else is doing for self, except for black people. I mean, and so it's you know, if you can just observe this when you just look around the Muslim community and look at the different events that come up, you know, and you see who's catering to who and who makes up the crowd, right? You know, people don't have to say it, but we know, you know, what's happening, that people are helping their own. But it becomes a problem a lot of times when African Americans decide to do the same thing, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, Islam has nothing to do with race, you know, or like we have people will put together a conference and, you know, a list of faces which are all light-skinned faces, and nobody says anything about it, or they're all white faces, and then they have a conference, it's all these black people who are Africans, and it's like, oh, Islam has nothing to do with racism. It's like, well, why is it okay to call it the Arab Spring? What if we called it the African Spring? When it's really more an African Spring, it wouldn't be Islamic then, you understand? So we have some issues in our community. So the point being that the somewhat sort of a self-empowerment approach, I guess you would say, in the African American community actually has been relatively successful for those who have actually adopted it. If you think of Booker T. Washington, established Tuskegee Institute and that particular approach, and then also the Nation of Islam. There are other examples which could be mentioned, but we have those two paradigms, and I just think that it's okay for us to have both of them, and we have to get used to. Just marching, forging ahead with in spite of the fact that they're just two different paradigms, because both of them are useful. Both of them are useful, and I do think we need more of the self-empowerment approach. Yeah. All right. Okay.
Before we move on to our next questioner, I just think we should check in with Brother Haroon. Do we have another question from online?
Yes, thank you. Okay. Wow, there's so many questions. How are we defining, quote unquote, black in the prophetic era or later classical periods by culture, phenotype, social status, skin tone? How does this compare to the contemporary U.S. definitions of blackness?
Right, good question. Because that's kind of like we're supposed to be talking about, right? Everything's related to. But yes, the prophetic age, black was a color. It meant a skin color. And most of the hadiths which mention black man, black woman, it's usually a reference to Africans, so Nubians or Ethiopians or Sudanese, those from that particular part of East Africa. So unless otherwise specified in the hadith about Arabs who are black, usually black is a reference to Africans in the hadith literature. Now, the Arabs themselves would qualify if we were to utilize modern day, or say North American standards for blackness, then the Arabs would qualify as black. Because, for us, black doesn't mean that you're black, that it, is a number of different, shades, there's a kaleidoscope of colors, right? And almost everybody in the room could qualify as black on one level or another. You can even look white, and if they discover you have some African blood, you're black. So that's the way it used to be. So, in many ways, still the way, same thing today. So they would qualify. And then even there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he, as reporters have said, I have been sent to the black and the red. And most of the commentators say that when he talks about the black, he's speaking about not only Africans, he's speaking about Arabs. And this is because the majority of the Arabs historically, were light and dark brown. That's what they were. That's the normative color, right? So again, but leaving aside the very fact that race in that period was largely cultural, meaning that it was determined by shared language, shared culture, shared religious beliefs, that we don't want to make the mistake of just simply saying, okay, well, yes, it's exactly the same, and it takes us into other discussions. So that has to be very clear in our minds. So a black Arab from Banu Sulaim, for instance, sees a Habashi, right? And when you put them together, stand them together, they may look the same. But the Habashi says, I'm not one of him. And the Arabi says, I'm not one of him. Why? Because different culture, different experience, you see? And so we have to kind of come to terms with that and understand, even amongst the Africans themselves, they didn't see themselves as a homogenous group, that we're all like from the same, mother, like some village in Africa. All the black people go back to, that's the mother village, and everybody originated there, or the white people somewhere in Europe, they all came from there. That's, at least that's not our belief. And I'm not totally sure that even anthropologists or even the evolutionists believe that, that's what occurred. Yes.
Walaikum salam. Thank you so much for this. You answered part of what I was going to ask in your last question. So,
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah. The question I want to have, is there a definition for what an Arab is, one? And then second, is there a color component that's attached to that? Like within the African American community, we had certain stratifications, and one was passing the brown paper bag test. So that's the first part. The second part has to do with for Africans or Negroes, and this is intended to be partly provocative, but let's say, take for example, a critique of the Maliki school. Would given some of the hadiths that are contained therein, place these African Muslims of today, me included, in a place of reduced status or second-class citizenship or some other form of captivity?
Yeah, well, the first issue about is there a definition of Arabs? You find Ibn Taymiyyah actually offers a definition for the Arab. He says an Arab is anyone whose parents are Arab, they speak the Arabic language, and they originate from the Arabian Peninsula, pretty much. Three issues. And so what fundamentally means, if we accept that definition as the definition of an original Arab, then it would mean that any Arab today outside of the Arabian Peninsula is not a true Arab, or let's say it was not an original Arab. And that would mean, Iraq, it would mean, Philistine, it would mean Syria, it would mean all of North Africa, right? That all of those countries which are Arabs today, they became Arabs, which is really interesting, because the one thing about cultural races is that it's easier for you to become one of the people, you see, because it's a cultural-based race. So once, you have children, your children, they grow up and, they speak Arabic, hey, well, you're one of them, right? If you're culturally that, or you intermarry with someone and then they forget where you originally came from, then that's what you become. And with regard to, again, colors, the Ibn Mamanawi, Ibn Athir, Ibn Manzur, and Lisan Arab, so many different scholars, when they describe the Arabs, they say Ghalib al-Alwan Arab al-Udma wa Sumra wa Uzma, that the predominant colors amongst the Arabs is light and dark brown, and that's what originally they were. But the fact that we find that the stereotypical Arab today is not a brown person, has a lot to do with history and has to do with the evolution of the Arab image, because of a lot of the more lighter-skinned people entering into Arabness. The other question was related to, like, you said something about black and something that about those hadiths that or things from the Maliki school may place them in a second-class citizenship status. This is one issue large that I'm dealing with regard to the law, which in the area of marriage, where this particular distinction was made between what we call the Diniya and the Sharifa, or the ignoble and the noble woman, and so then the black woman just happened to be one of a list of women, so I want to be clear about that too. I'm not saying that it's only a reference to the black woman, but I did want to highlight that when many of these scholars speak about the black woman as falling under this category, that they highlight her blackness as being the basis of her unattractiveness, rather than she's poor, or she's, you understand, like they do with the other type of, or she was a former slave, like, with these other women. So
So basically, what it does is it places her at a disadvantage in that that her own clansmen are not able to protect her. So a man comes up and says, "Yo, I'm going to marry you," and he says, "Oh, okay, well, nobody else seemed like they're interested." Say, "Hey, okay, no problem." But her clansmen, they decide, "Well, no. We don't want you to marry that guy. That guy is a crook or this or that." And he tells her the guy wants to marry her. And actually, this is a real true story. I know, but I have some stories like this. This actually happened, 20th century. It's like, "Oh, well, in the Maliki school, you don't need your dad's permission anyway, right?" Because, and actually tell the girl, and actually know of a situation where this actually happened. Where a brother who called himself Maliki wanted to marry an African American sister and justified her ignoring her father with quoting from the Maliki sources, right? So I don't know what happened with that situation, but it was definitely brought to my attention. So it does place them at somewhat of a disadvantage. It's somewhat of an institutionalized type of disadvantage which is there, because if you're a noblewoman, Sharifa, then you don't have the same type of freedom, as the ignoble woman. And that was a time when the more freedom you had, the less value you had. If you were valuable, then your freedom was limited. We had to protect you, right? Because you're valuable. If you have more freedom, whatever. You understand? It's like a stray camel or something like that. It's like, hey, well, that was the attitude of people. So that's there, and of course there's some hadith which are definitely problematic, and hopefully you read them once I publish the dissertation. But I think it's been. I don't want to keep us here all night because I think I could technically, But inshallah, tafadhal. Yes, sir.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
So you talked a little bit about the subjugation. I think you said the subjugation. I'm not sure. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Of Africans from what you said was the south of Africa who were cannibalistic, right?
East.
I'm not
East
sure
Africa.
if you
East Africa. Yeah, East Africa. Yeah.
Okay, East Africa who were cannibalistic. So my question was, well, I wanted to know if they were Muslims. And I think you said that they were subjugated. Okay, so they were not Muslim.
Right.
And if them not being Muslim was the reason that they had the status that they had.
Well,
or if it was more related to, their actual color.
Right, yeah. What I was saying is that the early anthropologists, I guess if you want to call them that, when they described the people of this part of Africa, they described them, one of the distinguishing characteristics was that they were cannibals, and then also they were naked. They didn't have clothing. And Ibn Khaldun, I believe, or at any rate, one of the authors I read about actually talked about how they were typically slaves as well of other people, of other Africans, they're like of Tukror and Ghana. They would invade them and they would take them, capture them, and make them into slaves. But this also was a time where Muslim thinking about the world in terms of civilization was that the Mediterranean was the sort of the hotbed of civilization. That the closer you were to the Mediterranean, the more civilized you were, the more pretty you were, everything. So the further away you got from the Mediterranean, the less civilized you were, the less attractive you were, among other things. So these were sub-equatorial people at a distance from the Mediterranean. So when you, like one particular book called Hudud al-Alam, The Limits of the World, it's an unknown author, but it was written, it's established as a book from centuries ago, that he actually, when he describes the Zanj, he speaks about them. He mentions that there are no Muslims amongst them. He says that. But then he goes a little further up north to the Zabbage people, and he says, he said, these people, they're half naked. The Zanj, they're completely naked. The Zabbage, they're half naked, and there's some Muslims amongst them, as if to imply that the reason that they're half naked as opposed to completely naked is because the Muslims are there, right? And then you go a little bit further, you go to Abyssinia, and he said, beautiful people, completely clothed, very nice, good, nice temperament. They're not warlike like the Zanj and others like that, right? And then people from Bahrain and Oman, they do trade with them and things like so. So a lot more Muslims now here, right? So as if to imply that the reason for them being more civilized now was because there are Muslims in their territories. Yeah.
So I think we have another question from the online audience.
Thank you. Brother Akil Fahad asks, would you still recommend using Ash-Shifa of Qadi Iyad, given the ruling therein toward the one who calls the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam black? And then also we have the example of Hajar, whose steps we all follow when we go to Mecca, who was an African woman. Do you think Muslims, I think in general, understand our history and those of color that made major contributions?
Yeah. Qadi Iyad Shifa, he does quote a scholar who says that anybody who calls a prophet black should be killed. And I think that is extremely problematic, and when we look at these particular quotes and the type of people they come from, we typically find that they're coming from people who are not even black to begin with. And also, when they explain, most of the people who explain their justification for this, they would say, oh, it's because to be black is something negative. It's a disparaging characteristic. And it's extremely problematic. It would mean that black people, all black Muslims had to say, then I am ugly, right? So as if it's my aqidah has to be that I'm an ugly person, then it's disparaging. As a matter of fact, I better not call my brother black, because because the Quran says don't call by offensive nicknames. It doesn't make sense, to believe that, but Imam Nawawi, different from this is that Imam Nawawi says something similar to this, but he goes on to explain and said the reason that, I'm not saying that you killed the person, but said that it's kufr to call the Prophet black, and he goes on and says that the reason is that you're describing him in a way that he was not. You're giving him a description that he did not have. So if you call him, say he was a, big, fat, bulky guy, he was super short or things like that. He said, well, it's unbelief. It's a statement of apostasy or a blasphemy against the Prophet. Whereas many of the other scholars who say, well, the reason that you can't say it is because it's bad to call somebody black. So Imam Nawawi's, his opinion is a bit more, much more fair, in my opinion. So you have that particular challenge in our tradition. The Prophet ﷺ didn't say, whoever calls me black, then you're a kafir, or whoever called me black, then you kill them. He didn't say that himself. But the other part of the question regarding our mother Hajar, or the Hajar, who was the concubine of Abraham, alayhi salam, who is believed to be the mother of either the Arab race or at least the Adnani branch of the Arab race, because they say that many of the historians, they say that the Arabs, in general, two categories, the Adnani and the Qahtani branches of the Arab race. So Adnan, it becomes a descendant of Ismail, the son of Abraham, Ishmael. And so the Prophet Muhammad descends through his particular line. Hajar was Coptic, and believed to be a black woman. And, so she was a mother of Ismail. So if the Arabs are from Adnan, or Adnan from Ismail, and Ismail is from Hajar, then kind of qualifies you as being black on one level, right? But of course, that's if we are thinking in modern sort of terms about we call race taxonomies, modern taxonomies, and so where in the back and in the past it was cultural races, we're dealing with biological races, races or racism, and we have to be very careful to make that clear distinction between the way that people in the past perceive themselves and what the basis of group identity, affiliation, and why we feel differently about it today, even though if we go to different countries, we'll find different sort of taxonomies. So we have the one-drop rule in the United States. We got the one drop rule in Brazil too, but it's the opposite. You know, one drop rule here. You discover any amount of African blood, you're black. In Brazil, any amount of European blood, you're not black anymore. So you understand, it's just different taxonomies. You know, so this is the way things are, and we have to be sure not to continue to graft the old world on the new world, or vice versa.
Okay, so I'm already letting us run over a little bit late because this is so fascinating. But maybe we can have our next two questioners. And Imam, say, do you have your notebook? Do you want to ask a question too? Yes. Okay. Well, then maybe we'll have you three ask your questions together, and then Sheikh Abdullah can respond to them.
I remember everything.
Inshallah.
I'm going to try to make it very short. Thank you very much for your enlightening talk. I get a few questions. Short. Yeah. Number one is like you're very much exploring the issue of the Maliki school, and don't ask me the name of the scholar I'm now referring to, but as far as I remember, it was a scholar in Iraq between the 14th and the 16th century approximately, who actually said that a prerequisite, a necessary trait for a scholar to be a scholar is to be black. I was just wondering, because you were actually speaking about the issue of black race, how much have you come also across something quite different to this kind of discourse? Have you ever come across discourses like these? The second question is, I mean, obviously you were speaking about Afro-Arabian Muslim consciousness, and your field of research was not so much the scriptures, but you again and again were connecting to questions of the hadith and the prophet, and I was just wondering if you talk also about the Quran and the question of how is blackness and whiteness framed in the Quranic scripture itself. Either you did that yourself, if you can elaborate on that, or if there are studies and you can tell us about a bit more about this. Another a side question regarding your issue when you elaborated on the Maliki school and the question, because you were speaking about race as an experience, not so much about race as part of a racist structure of power and hierarchy. So my question here is, I don't know whether there is some research also connected to this question of the imagination of blackness, of what that really meant in terms of structural racism in these Muslim societies. I mean, obviously, the black woman was not so much privileged in her position, but was there more than that?
Yeah, So the first issue about coming across any statements that, like the one you mentioned about qualification, a condition for being a scholar, you have to be black. I've never come across that particular statement itself, but what needs to be understood, I think, about people in that time is, though we're focusing on black, we have to understand too that this similar disdain that Arabs may have entertained towards Africans, it also went the other way, right? It wasn't just a one-way street, right? It's just like, the Arabs don't like black people. The Africans also didn't like Arabs, you see, and so Arabs would have had just as much of a bad time if they went to Abyssinia, generally speaking, if not under the sort of the aegis of the Negus, as we know with the Sahaba themselves, but there's a historical literature that shows that, that slight exchange between the two parts of the world, and then you remember Assertion, he's from Ethiopia, right? He wanted to destroy the Kaaba, so there were reasons they had to despise blacks as well, beyond just simply them not liking color. In the Quran, that black and white are juxtaposed as, generally positive and negative. Like one verse, that on the day when faces turn from white and some faces turn black, and so those whose faces will turn white will be in paradise, and those whose faces turn black will be in hell. But they're metaphors. And then, blackness, you find it is utilized to indicate dismay, fear, sadness, a number of different things like that in the Quran. And I think the last one was, the last issue you asked about, you mentioned was... right. All right, yes, so again, the issue, I think that's kind of connected with the first part of the answer with regard to if there were things that manifest themselves in terms of like institutionalized type of racism. And again, if I'm in Nubia, for instance, and I'm not a Nubi, then it will be a challenge for me to have the privileges that others have, right? As an Arab, you see, and vice versa. So regardless, that's just the world that as it used to exist, you see. So it wasn't just simply one way, that people were extremely xenophobic. People were extremely xenophobic towards other people. So it wasn't just, against black people, right? Because even the people themselves, again, they're not defining themselves as based upon color to begin with, you see. So they have a lot of difference among them, color difference among them, but they're locking people out of privilege was based upon, them not sharing our culture with us, not sharing our religion with us, not sharing our language with us. So of course, you're just gonna, have a hard time. So other than like this example, I try to focus on with regard to marriage, which itself an example of an institutional issue, you can say, an institutionalized sort of racist type of consideration. But on another level, it gives consideration to just the very fact of a person in a society who is living as a minority, who is unlikely to be, I guess you would say, desirable to most of the men in society because there happen to be that particular anomaly. And they're going to go after the other woman, you see. So not only the black woman, but the former slave, the manumit, the unattractive white, convert, whatever as well, who's there, had similar problems. Women who just made their work, but they were just like servants and things like that, or they pounded flour for a living. A lot of them, all of them were given the opportunity to actually get married. In one sense, you could say, well, at least they had an opportunity to get married on one level. But it's just the problem of trying to fathom the members of their clan in particular not being able to protect them and just simply going against those wishes. I think that's what becomes more problematic. Yeah. Inshallah, it looks like we probably can talk after a little bit more, like you have some more on your mind. So.
Thank you. So my question is, were there in your research, did you find particular periods of dynastic history or lineage or dynasties in which racially biased rulings seemed particularly prevalent, such as maybe the Idrisid instead of the Songhai? And did you find, or if you did, what were the correlations that you found in the racial identity, such as the Idrisids claiming Arab lineage, to the rulings made in that particular dynasties, made under those dynasties in regard to the lineage of that ruling class and their racial identity, if you can even claim that for that period?
Well, if you think of Iraq and I believe it's the 10th century, when's the Zanj revolt? It's 9th or 10th century? Do you remember? Maybe the 10th century, I think, or between the two of them. AD, right? Yeah, exactly. The Zanj revolts in Iraq, which is a large contingent of what we call Negroes, who many of them slaves who rebelled, something like a slave rebellion that happened in Iraq in response to lack of mistreatment. It also coincided with the revolt of people who were termed Shu'ubiyya, right? And this was a large Persian contingent as well, who also rebelled against the Arab sort of aristocracy, if you want to call it that. And so it wasn't just simply the blacks who were being discriminated against, it was also the Persians. So, and during this time, a lot of literature started to be written which argued that unless you declared Arabs to be superior, I'm not talking about morally superior, but I'm talking about, sort of biologically, if you say superior, then you are a heretic, right? So the people who didn't acknowledge that Arab superiority or the Arab fadl, then they were termed or slighted with the term shu'ubiyya, right? So there have definitely been some times, and also, you know, they were decrying, the Persians were decrying the very fact of the lopsided treatment. The Arabs were given a whole lot of privileges, financial privileges, and other things, but they were not given the same sort of privileges, even though Islam was not supposed to be discriminating on that basis. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khair. The revolt was late 9th.
Huh?
The Zanj revolt, late 9th
The Zanj
century.
late 9th century.
Because it started in 863
Right, okay.
AD.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, my question is, there were quite a few, but I'll limit it in the interest of time to this one. In that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he sent his companions to the protection of an African king who he praised, and he adopted Zaid bin Haritha, who's described by Ibn Jawzi, Tanwir Qabish, as a very dark-skinned person.
With the pudgy nose.
With a flat nose. And he then, when Zaid and Ayman, Baraka al-Habashiyya, was an Ethiopian woman who he described as his mother, Ummi Ba'da Ummi. Naam. And when Ayman and Zaid bin Haritha married, and Zaid was also called Hibbu Rasulillah, the beloved of the Messenger of Allah. And when Ayman, who was African, and Zaid, who was probably from the black Arab, Arab al-Sauda, they had Usama bin Zaid, who was also described as a black person of dark complexion, but he was called Hibbu Rasulillah, the beloved of the Messenger of Allah. And so Zayd he adopted as his son before the practice was outlawed. Ayman, who was African, he called his mother. He sent his companions to the care of an African king who he praises for his justice and fairness, etc. Why do you think those things are not highlighted in our history, even in our study of the Sirah? They're kind of passed over. Why do you think that's the case?
I think that the reason that they're not really studied is because Muslims largely have adopted a sort of blackout policy. Is where we think, again, as I mentioned before, and I've come across this and gotten this reaction quite a bit over the years, is that once you start talking about something black or black people, then there's this visceral reaction that you get from a lot of Muslims. You know, it's like, Islam is not a racist religion, right? You know, it's like, and it only happens when you talk about blackness. But you can talk about any other people. You can talk about Egyptian. You can talk about being, Syrian. You can talk about being Palestinian. You understand? You know, you mention all that, but not, African or whatever, Nigerian, Sudanese, whatever it may be. There's a visceral reaction that people have. And I think that people feel that to highlight the color of Zayd ibn Haritha or Osama ibn Zayd, or even, well, people don't even know, too, like Amr ibn As, his mother was Ethiopian. His mother, Amr ibn As, the one who opened up Egypt. And his brother, who his brother was, Uqba ibn Nafi', who opened up the rest of North Africa, established Qayrawan. He was had the same mother. These are half African Arabs, but they weren't talked about in the books of Sirah as being African. Why? Because their fathers were Arabs. You see, so there was intermarriage quite a bit. You see, and so it's not talked about that much, but people will constantly remind you the Prophet was white, right? It's okay to talk about that and highlight the Prophet's color, but when you talk about anybody else's color, especially if it's black, then it's an issue. It's why are you talking about, man, it has nothing to do with Islam. Okay, well, why is it calling the Prophet white has anything to do with Islam? If calling Sahaba black and highlighting their color has nothing to do with Islam, then we shouldn't be talking about the Prophet being white. And that in itself is debatable too. That term, again, the problematic term. We know what white means in our cultural, in our milieu. We know what it means, right? The Prophet wasn't European, right? And he wasn't black either. He wasn't an African, because that's what we say. Black, we think African, and white, we think European. The Prophet wasn't either of those things, And so we should stop translating Azhar alone as white, right? If anything, it's like Imam Zahabi said, that anytime the Arabs said Abyad, they meant Hantiyu alone. They meant this weak-colored. So the Prophet was weak-colored, right? Not white, not black either, but he was weak-colored, because a few narrations, they call him Abyad, like white. And even Abyad in the Arabs was an offensive term. It's derogatory to call somebody white. It's exactly why they didn't call the Persians and the Syrians and the Persians, Syrians, and who else? But basically the people who the Arabs considered to be white, they didn't see themselves as a white race. You see, the ones that they called white, they actually didn't call them white. They called them red, right? So the people of Syria, and the Romans, the Europeans, they were red people. That's what the Arabs called them. They called them Ahmar. That's when in the Hadith, بعثت إلى الأحمر والأسود، بعثت إلى الأسود والأحمر. I was sent to the black and to the red. The red is a reference to the white people, right? Because you didn't call a person white, because to say the person's up there, it meant you had baras. It meant you had vitiligo, discoloration, and loss of pigmentation. Remember, the Arabs were largely brown people, right? Right. So it's like, I'm not Abyad. You call me white. I'm not white. They found it unattractive. Pale white was an unattractive color. The Prophet wasn't. He didn't look like a Syrian. He didn't look like a Persian. He didn't look like a European. He didn't. That wasn't his white. It was not. So I just think that like I said, I think it's sort of as a blackout. It's like we only get bothered by race when we start talking about black. And this is what I'm talking about, this perennial black antipathy, this perennial disdain for blackness and darker skin, right? That is something that we have to kind of work through. We kind of try to work it out on some level, so.
I guess I just want to check in with the back room. Should we try and squeeze in one last question?
Oh man, that's a tough one.
I know. Maybe
we have plenty.
Yes, maybe we should wrap up and let everybody get home and get some rest this evening. So thank you, Dr. Ali, for your great talk.
So, inshallah, Imam Zaid asked me to end the dua. Imam Zaid, you come and make dua. Come on, you do it. No, Imam Zaid, you do it. Come on, Imam Zaid, please. Wallah. Come on. Imam Zaid, please. Yeah. Tfaddal. Yeah. Oh Allah, we ask you for guidance. We ask you for protection. Oh Allah, we ask you to unite our hearts upon goodness. We ask you to allow us to see the goodness in one another. We ask you to grant us the tawfiq, the grace and success to treat one another in the right way. We ask you to touch the hearts of those who misunderstand one another, and make them see the humanity and the beauty that each of us we have. And we ask you to grant us paradise and to protect us from any harm that may come to us in this world and the hereafter. ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم ربنا زدنا ولا تنقصنا وأكرمنا ولا تهنا وأعطنا ولا تحرمنا وآثرنا ولا تؤثر علينا وارض عنا وأرضنا يا رب العالمين اللهم آت أنفسنا تقواها وزكها أنت خير من زكاها أنت وليها ومولاها ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى اللهم وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الأخيار وسلم تسليما كثيرا وسبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين بارك الله فيكم